The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Judge Elaine Montgomery pulled into her usual parking spot. Today was Thursday, which meant a packed schedule of cases waiting for her attention. After 15 years on the bench, she had developed a routine that rarely varied. Arrive by 7:30, review case notes over coffee in her chambers, and be ready when court opened at 9 sharp. The courthouse was a second home to her. As one of only 3 black women ever appointed to the bench in the county's history, she had worked twice as hard to earn her position. Her reputation for fairness and thorough understanding of the law had earned her the respect of most attorneys who appeared before her, even when they disagreed with her rulings. This morning, however, would break from routine in ways she couldn't have imagined. Judge Montgomery gathered her leather briefcase and travel mug from the passenger seat. She hadn't bothered with her judicial robe yet. That hung in her chambers waiting for her arrival like an old friend. Instead, she wore a tailored navy pantsuit, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her courthouse ID badge hung around her neck on a lanyard, clearly visible against her cream-colored blouse. The early hour meant the public entrance wasn't open yet. Like other employees, she headed toward the staff entrance at the side of the building. She nodded to familiar faces, court reporters, clerks and attorneys rushing in with coffee in hand, preparing for their own busy days. As she approached the staff entrance, she noticed someone new at the security desk. Most mornings it was Officer Trent, an older guard who'd been working at the courthouse since before she became a judge. They had a standing joke about the weather forecast and how it never seemed to match what actually happened. But today, a different officer stood at the checkpoint, someone she didn't recognize. Officer James Brennan had transferred from the Northern Precinct just 3 days ago. At 42, he carried himself with the stiff authority of someone who believed the uniform made the man. His previous assignment had been in a predominantly white suburban area, and this downtown position was an adjustment he wasn't entirely comfortable with. As Judge Montgomery approached, she smiled politely. "Good morning," she said, already reaching for her ID badge to scan it at the checkpoint. Officer Brennan's eyes narrowed slightly. "Ma'am, this entrance is for courthouse personnel only." She paused, her smile faltering just a bit. She tapped her clearly visible ID badge. "Yes, I know. I'm Judge Montgomery. Courtroom 3B. The officer didn't move to let her pass. Instead, he looked her up and down, his expression dubious. "Do you have any additional identification?" Behind her, 2 other courthouse employees, both white men from the district attorney's office, walked up. Officer Brennan nodded to them, barely glancing at their badges as they passed through with a casual, "Morning, gentlemen." Judge Montgomery took a deep breath. This wasn't the first time she'd experienced this kind of treatment, but it had been a while since it happened in her own workplace. She opened her wallet and produced her driver's license. "Here you go, officer," she said, her voice level but cooler than before. Officer Brennan took the license and studied it far longer than necessary, glancing between her face and the photo several times. Around them, the morning flow of courthouse employees continued. Several people nodded to Judge Montgomery as they passed, a few with puzzled expressions at seeing her held up at security. "What business do you have in the courthouse today?" Officer Brennan asked, still holding her license. The question hung in the air for a moment. Judge Montgomery blinked, wondering if she'd misheard. "I told you, I'm Judge Montgomery. I have court in 90 minutes. She pointed to her ID badge again. "That's my courthouse identification. I've been a judge here for 15 years. A court clerk named Denise, who often worked in Judge Montgomery's courtroom, approached the checkpoint. She smiled warmly at the judge before noticing the tense situation. "Good morning, Your Honor. Is everything okay?" Denise asked. Before Judge Montgomery could answer, Officer Brennan cut in. "Ma'am, please move along. I'm conducting a security check." Denise hesitated, looking between the officer and the judge with concern. Judge Montgomery gave her a small smile and slight nod, and Denise reluctantly continued through the checkpoint, looking back over her shoulder. "Officer," Judge Montgomery began again, keeping her voice steady, "I've shown you my courthouse ID and my driver's license. Is there a specific security concern I should know about?" Officer Brennan finally handed back her license. "We've had issues with people trying to bypass security recently. Just doing my job thoroughly." As he spoke, the courthouse administrator, Richard Wilson, approached the entrance. In his mid-60s with silver hair and a tailored suit, he smiled broadly as he spotted Judge Montgomery. "Elaine," Just the person I wanted to see. Do you have a minute before court to discuss that education initiative you proposed? Officer Brennan's posture shifted subtly. You know this woman, sir? Richard's smile faltered, his eyes moving between the officer and the judge. Know her? Of course I know her. This is Judge Montgomery, one of our most respected criminal court judges. His tone carried a hint of confusion and concern. I was just explaining to the officer that I work here, Judge Montgomery said, her expression carefully neutral despite the slow burn of humiliation and anger building inside her. Richard's face darkened with understanding. Officer, is there a problem here? No problem, sir, Officer Brennan said quickly. Just being thorough with security protocols. Perhaps too thorough with some and not thorough enough with others, Judge Montgomery observed quietly, noting how many people had passed through with barely a glance while she was detained. Richard placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. Elaine, I'm so sorry about this. Officer Brennan is new to our courthouse. He turned to the officer. I expect all our judges to be treated with the respect their position deserves. Is that understood? Yes, sir, Officer Brennan replied stiffly, finally stepping aside to let Judge Montgomery pass. As she walked through the security checkpoint, Judge Montgomery felt a familiar weight settle on her shoulders. It was a weight she'd carried since law school, through her years as a public defender, then a prosecutor, and now as a judge. The weight of having to prove again and again that she belonged in spaces where people who looked like her were still too rare. She nodded to Richard. Thank you. I'll come by your office later about that initiative. As she walked toward the elevator, she noticed 3 black courthouse employees watching the interaction. Their expressions told her everything. Not surprise, but the weary recognition of a scene they'd witnessed or experienced themselves too many times. One of them, a young security officer named Kevin, caught her eye and gave her a nearly imperceptible nod of solidarity. In the privacy of the elevator, Judge Montgomery allowed herself a moment. She closed her eyes and took 3 deep breaths, centering herself as she'd learned to do over years of facing situations just like this one. The anger was there, justified and real, but she couldn't afford to let it consume her, not with a courtroom full of people depending on her clear judgment in less than an hour. When the elevator doors opened on the 3rd floor, Judge Montgomery had composed herself again. She walked with purpose toward her chambers, greeting the court staff she passed with her usual warmth. To anyone watching, she appeared completely unfazed by the incident downstairs. Her judicial assistant, Teresa, looked up from her computer as Judge Montgomery entered the outer office. After working together for 12 years, Teresa could read the judge's mood with uncanny accuracy. Good morning, Judge. Coffee's fresh. And I've put today's files on your desk in order of appearance. She paused, studying Judge Montgomery's face. Everything okay? Judge Montgomery managed a small smile. Just another day of being reminded some people can't see beyond what they expect to see. She shook her head slightly. It's nothing I haven't handled before. Teresa's expression softened with understanding. Anything I can do? Actually, yes, Judge Montgomery said after a moment's consideration. Could you find out who that new security officer is at the staff entrance? And maybe get me the contact information for whoever's in charge of courthouse security these days? Of course, Teresa said, already making a note. Will you be filing a complaint? Judge Montgomery set her briefcase down, considering the question carefully. A complaint might result in discipline for the officer, but would it address the underlying problem? Would it change anything meaningful in how the courthouse functioned? In who felt welcome and who felt suspected? I'm not sure yet, she answered honestly. But I think something needs to be done. Not just about one officer, but about what happened this morning and why it keeps happening. She looked out her office window at the city spreading out below, the same city she had sworn to serve with equal justice for all. In that moment, Judge Montgomery made a decision. This incident wouldn't be brushed aside or forgotten. Somehow, she would find a way to turn this morning's humiliation into something that mattered, something that might actually create change. With that resolution made, she turned to the case files waiting on her desk. She had work to do, justice to administer. And later, she would figure out exactly how to address what had happened in a way that might actually make a difference. Not just for her, but for everyone who'd ever been made to feel they didn't belong in the halls of justice. Judge Montgomery tried to focus on the case files spread across her desk, but the morning's incident kept replaying in her mind. The way Officer Brennan had looked at her, dismissing her identity despite the badge around her neck. The casual way he'd waved through the white employees while scrutinizing her credentials. The familiar sting of being treated as if she didn't belong in her own workplace. A knock at her chamber door interrupted her thoughts. Teresa poked her head in. "Judge, I have that information you asked for. The officer's name is James Brennan. He transferred here 3 days ago from the Northern Precinct. And the head of courthouse security is still Chief Luis Rodriguez." Judge Montgomery nodded. "Thank you, Teresa. Could you ask Chief Rodriguez if he has time to meet with me during the lunch recess?" "Already did," Teresa said with a knowing smile. "He'll be here at 12:30. Judge Montgomery smiled gratefully at her assistant's efficiency. "What would I do without you?" "Probably still be arguing with that security guard at the front entrance," Teresa replied with a raised eyebrow. The comment broke the tension, and Judge Montgomery found herself laughing despite everything. Probably so. At 8:45, she slipped into her judicial robe and headed toward courtroom 3B. The familiar weight of the black robe settled on her shoulders, a reminder of her position and the responsibility that came with it. For the next few hours, she would focus on delivering justice to those who appeared before her. The morning's incident would have to wait. The morning session proceeded smoothly, with several plea agreements and 2 sentencing hearings. Judge Montgomery maintained her reputation for fairness, listening carefully to all sides before making her decisions. No one in the courtroom would have guessed that anything unusual had happened earlier. At noon, she called a recess and returned to her chambers. She had barely settled at her desk when Teresa announced that 2 visitors were waiting to see her. "Chief Rodriguez is here," Teresa said, "and he's brought Officer Brennan with him." Judge Montgomery hadn't expected the officer to accompany the security chief. She took a deep breath, adjusting her approach. "Send them in, please." Chief Rodriguez entered first, a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and a serious expression. Behind him, Officer Brennan looked significantly less confident than he had that morning, his posture stiff and uncomfortable. "Judge Montgomery," Chief Rodriguez began, "I understand there was an incident this morning at the staff entrance. I wanted to address it immediately." Judge Montgomery gestured for them to sit. "Thank you for coming so quickly, Chief Rodriguez. Officer Brennan has something he'd like to say," the chief prompted, giving the officer a pointed look. Officer Brennan cleared his throat. "Judge Montgomery, I apologize for the misunderstanding this morning. I'm new to this courthouse and still learning who everyone is." The carefully worded non-apology hung in the air. Judge Montgomery studied the officer's face, seeing not remorse but embarrassment at being called out. "Officer Brennan," she said evenly, "what happened this morning wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a pattern I've seen too many times before." The officer shifted in his seat. "I was just following security protocols, Your Honor." "Were you?" "Because I noticed several courthouse employees walked through with barely a glance at their IDs while you held me up and questioned my right to be there." She kept her tone, professional but firm. "I'm not sure what you're implying," Officer Brennan said, a defensive edge creeping into his voice. "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating what happened." Judge Montgomery turned to Chief Rodriguez. "Chief, how many black judges serve in this courthouse?" "4, including yourself, Your Honor," he replied promptly. "And how many total judges do we have?" 23, Judge Montgomery nodded. "Less than 20%, despite serving a county where over 40% of residents are people of color." She turned back to Officer Brennan. "So when you see a black woman heading for the judge's chambers, your first assumption is that she doesn't belong there?" Officer Brennan's face flushed. "That's not fair. I didn't know who you were. My ID badge clearly identified me as Judge E. Montgomery. The same ID badge that other employees showed you without question," Chief Rodriguez interjected. "Judge, I want you to know that we take this very seriously. All security personnel are required to complete anti-bias training, and Officer Brennan will be attending a refresher course immediately." Judge Montgomery considered this another training course that would likely change nothing. She thought of the young black security officer who had nodded to her that morning, and of all the others who experienced similar treatment daily without the protection of a judge's robe. "Training is necessary but not sufficient, Chief," she said finally. "What happened this morning is part of a larger pattern, and it affects more than just me." Before she could continue, there was another knock at the door, and Teresa poked her head in again. "I'm sorry to interrupt. Judge, but your 1 p.m. hearing is ready to begin, and all parties are present. Judge Montgomery nodded. Thank you, Teresa. Tell them I'll be right there. She turned back to her visitors. Gentlemen, we'll have to continue this another time. As they stood to leave, an idea began to form in her mind. Officer Brennan, she said, since you're new to this courthouse, perhaps you'd benefit from seeing what happens in these chambers you were so carefully guarding. The officer looked confused. Your Honor, I'm inviting you to observe my courtroom this afternoon, not as punishment, but as an opportunity to understand the work we do here. She looked at Chief Rodriguez. With your permission, of course. The chief seemed surprised but nodded. I think that would be educational if Your Honor is comfortable with it. Then it settled. Officer Brennan, you'll join me in courtroom 3B for the remainder of the day. You can take a seat in the observer section. She gathered her notes for the upcoming hearing. I have a full docket this afternoon, including several cases I think might interest you. Officer Brennan looked like he wanted to object but glanced at his superior and thought better of it. Yes, Your Honor, he said stiffly. As Judge Montgomery walked back to her courtroom, her mind raced with possibilities. The afternoon session included a case involving a young black man being charged with resisting arrest during a traffic stop. The evidence was questionable at best, and she had serious concerns about how the arrest had been conducted. Perhaps witnessing this case might give Officer Brennan something to think about. The courtroom fell silent as she entered, everyone rising as the bailiff announced, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Elaine Montgomery." She took her seat at the bench, her gaze briefly meeting Officer Brennan's as he slipped into the back row of the observers section. He looked uncomfortable and out of place in the formal setting of the courtroom. Good, she thought. Maybe now he understood a fraction of how she had felt that morning. You may be seated, she said to the courtroom. We'll begin with case number 2025 CR 4872, State versus Thomas Henderson. The young man was brought in, dressed in an orange jumpsuit that seemed too big for his slender frame. At 22, Thomas Henderson had no prior criminal record, but now faced potential jail time for allegedly resisting officers during what should have been a routine traffic stop for a broken taillight. As the proceedings began, Judge Montgomery maintained her usual professional demeanor, but she was acutely aware of Officer Brennan watching from the back. This case would show him exactly why her work mattered and why assumptions based on race had no place in their justice system. The defense attorney argued passionately that the dashcam footage didn't match the officer's report. Your Honor, my client didn't resist arrest. The video clearly shows he complied with all commands but was still forcibly removed from his vehicle. The prosecutor countered, the footage doesn't capture everything. Your Honor, the officers report that Mr. Henderson was verbally resistant and made threatening movements. Judge Montgomery addressed the young defendant directly. Mr. Henderson, would you like to make a statement to the court about what happened that night? Thomas Henderson stood, hands trembling slightly. Yes, Your Honor. I was scared when they pulled me over. My cousin was beaten by police last year during a traffic stop, and I just kept thinking about that. I did everything they asked. I kept my hands where they could see them. I spoke respectfully, but they still yanked me out of the car and pushed me to the ground. From her position at the bench, Judge Montgomery could see Officer Brennan's expression changing as he listened to the testimony and watched the dashcam footage when it was played for the court. The disconnect between the written report and what actually happened was stark. After hearing all the evidence, Judge Montgomery made her ruling. Based on the video evidence and testimony presented, I find insufficient evidence to support the charge of resisting arrest. Case dismissed. She looked directly at Thomas Henderson. Mr. Henderson, you're free to go. The relief on the young man's face was palpable. His mother in the gallery burst into tears, mouthing thank you to the judge. As the afternoon progressed through more cases, Judge Montgomery occasionally glanced at Officer Brennan. His initial defensiveness seemed to be shifting to something more thoughtful as he witnessed the human consequences of the legal system up close. When the final case concluded at 4:45, Judge Montgomery addressed the courtroom. That concludes today's docket. Court is adjourned until 9 a.m. tomorrow. As people filed out, she noticed Officer Brennan lingering, seemingly unsure if he should leave or wait to speak with her. She made a small gesture indicating he should wait. When the courtroom had emptied, she stepped down from the bench and approached him. "What did you think of our proceedings, Officer Brennan?" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "It was educational, Your Honor. Different than I expected." "Different how?" she pressed gently. "I guess I never really thought about what happens after an arrest, how one officer's report can change someone's whole life." He paused. "That Henderson case, if you hadn't looked closely at the evidence, an innocent young man might have gone to jail," she finished for him. "And that happens more often than you might think, especially to young men who look like Mr. Henderson." Officer Brennan nodded slowly, a new understanding beginning to dawn in his eyes. The confrontation that had begun that morning was transforming into something neither of them had anticipated, the first step toward a conversation that might actually matter. The courthouse had mostly emptied by the time Judge Montgomery finished her conversation with Officer Brennan. Only the cleaning staff and a few dedicated attorneys remained, preparing for the next day's battles in the halls of justice. "Would you walk with me, Officer Brennan?" Judge Montgomery asked, gathering her notes from the bench. "I think we should continue our discussion." The officer hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yes, Your Honor." They walked together from the courtroom toward her chambers, an unlikely pair, she still in her judicial robes, he in his security uniform. The power dynamic between them had shifted dramatically since their morning encounter. "That last case today," Judge Montgomery said as they walked. "The young man charged with drug possession. What did you think of it?" Officer Brennan considered the question. The evidence seemed thin. The drugs weren't actually on him, but in the general area. Yet he spent 3 months in jail awaiting trial because he couldn't afford bail, she pointed out. 3 months away from his job, his apartment, his family, all for charges that didn't hold up under scrutiny. The officer was quiet for a moment. "I never really thought about that part before." They reached her chambers and Judge Montgomery gestured for him to enter. Teresa had already left for the day, leaving them privacy for their conversation. "Please have a seat," Judge Montgomery said, removing her judicial robe and hanging it carefully on the coat rack before sitting down behind her desk. Without the robe, she was simply a professional woman in a navy suit. The same woman Officer Brennan had refused to recognize that morning. "Officer Brennan, I've been thinking about what happened today, both this morning at the security checkpoint and this afternoon in my courtroom." He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Your Honor, I want to apologize again about this morning. I made a mistake." Judge Montgomery studied him, trying to determine if his remorse was genuine or merely a response to being caught and reprimanded. "What I'm interested in is understanding the nature of that mistake. Do you understand why what happened was problematic?" Officer Brennan frowned slightly. "I should have recognized you as a judge." "That's not it," she said gently. "The problem wasn't that you failed to recognize me specifically. The problem was that you couldn't imagine a black woman as a judge, so you assumed I didn't belong." His face flushed. "That's not—" "Please," she interrupted, raising a hand. "I've been a black woman in the legal profession for 25 years. This wasn't my first experience with this kind of treatment, and unfortunately, it probably won't be my last." She leaned forward. "What I'm trying to help you understand is that these mistakes have real consequences." Outside her window, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across her office. Judge Montgomery thought carefully about how to proceed. This conversation could go several ways. It could devolve into defensiveness and anger, or it could become an opportunity for genuine understanding. "Let me tell you about my first day as a law student," she said. Choosing the path of personal connection, I walked into that classroom at Harvard Law, one of only 11 black students in a class of 500. A white professor stopped me at the door and told me I must be in the wrong building, that the undergrad classes were in a different building across campus. Officer Brennan listened, his expression unreadable. When I told him I was a law student, he laughed and asked to see my ID. Even after I showed it to him, he said there must have been a mistake. She smiled slightly at the memory. I graduated second in my class 3 years later, and that same professor wrote me a recommendation letter for my first job, admitting his error in judgment. "What did you do?" Officer Brennan asked. "When he stopped you that day?" "The same thing I did this morning with you. I showed my ID. I stated who I was and why I belonged there. I remained professional despite the humiliation." She met his eyes directly. "But here's what you should understand. Each of these incidents takes a toll. They're reminders that no matter our achievements, some people will always see our skin color first and everything else second. Officer Brennan looked down at his hands. I've never thought of it that way. Most people don't unless they've experienced it, she acknowledged. That's why I invited you to my courtroom today. Not to embarrass you, but to show you why these mistakes matter so much. Every day I make decisions that affect people's lives. People who often look more like me than like you. If those in our justice system can't see past their own biases, how can we possibly deliver equal justice? A silence fell between them as Officer Brennan seemed to absorb her words. Judge Montgomery watched the understanding slowly dawn across his face. The Henderson case, he said finally. If another judge had been assigned, exactly, she nodded. Someone who might have been more inclined to believe the officer's report without questioning the video evidence. I saw officers write reports like that in my old precinct, he admitted quietly. Embellishing what happened to justify an arrest. I never spoke up about it. Judge Montgomery felt a small spark of hope at his candor. And now? He met her gaze. I'm starting to see why I should have. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Chief Rodriguez entered, looking between the two of them with curiosity. Judge Montgomery, I wanted to check in before the end of the day. I hope Officer Brennan's observation was educational? Judge Montgomery nodded. Very much so. In fact, we were just having a productive discussion about perception and reality in our justice system. Chief Rodriguez looked pleased but slightly surprised. That's good to hear. Officer Brennan, you're scheduled for security duty at the main entrance tomorrow morning. Before Officer Brennan could respond, Judge Montgomery had an idea. Actually, Chief, if you could spare him, I'd like Officer Brennan to join me again tomorrow. I'm hearing a case that I think would be particularly instructive given our discussion today. The security chief raised his eyebrows but nodded. If that's what you prefer, Judge, I'll adjust the rotation. After Chief Rodriguez left, Officer Brennan turned to Judge Montgomery with a confused expression. Why would you want me in your courtroom again? Because tomorrow's case involves a police officer being sued for excessive force against a black teenager. It's a civil case, not criminal, but it demonstrates exactly what we've been discussing. She watched his reaction carefully. Unless you'd prefer to return to security duty? Officer Brennan considered this. No, he said finally. I'd like to see it. Judge Montgomery nodded, satisfied. Good. Be in courtroom 3B at 9 a.m. As Officer Brennan rose to leave, he paused at the door. Your Honor, I have a question. Why are you doing this? After how I treated you this morning, you'd have every right to file a complaint to demand I be disciplined or transferred. Judge Montgomery considered her answer carefully. Because discipline doesn't create change, Officer Brennan. Understanding does. And we need change much more than we need punitive action. He nodded slowly. Thank you for the opportunity, Judge Montgomery. I'll see you tomorrow morning. After he left, Judge Montgomery remained at her desk, reflecting on the day's events. What had started as yet another demeaning experience had somehow transformed into an opportunity for education and growth. She wasn't naive enough to believe that one afternoon in her courtroom had completely changed Officer Brennan's worldview. But it was a start. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her husband. Dinner's ready whenever you get home. Everything okay? You're later than usual. She smiled and typed back. Just finishing up. Had an interesting day. I'll tell you all about it when I get home. As she gathered her belongings to leave, her thoughts turned to tomorrow. The case on her docket was a difficult one, a lawsuit brought by the family of a 16-year-old black boy who had been thrown to the ground and handcuffed during a community basketball game after a white woman reported him as suspicious. The officer had claimed he was following protocol. The body camera footage told a different story. Judge Montgomery knew that having Officer Brennan observe this case was a risk. He might revert to defensiveness, might side automatically with the officer being sued, but she was willing to take that risk because she had seen something in him today, a willingness to question his assumptions, to consider perspectives different from his own. As she drove home, Judge Montgomery thought about the larger picture. One conversation with one officer wouldn't fix the systemic problems in their justice system, but perhaps it was a start, a small ripple that might grow into something more significant. Her husband, William, greeted her at the door with a kiss. Rough day? He asked, reading the weariness in her face. Challenging, she corrected, but potentially worthwhile. She set down her briefcase and kicked off her shoes. I had an encounter this morning that reminded me why the work I do matters. Over dinner, she told him about Officer Brennan, about the checkpoint confrontation and the afternoon in her courtroom. William listened attentively, his face showing the familiar mix of anger and resignation that came with hearing yet another story of discrimination. "You think you got through to him?" he asked when she finished. Judge Montgomery considered the question. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I think I opened a door. Whether he walks through it is up to him." Later that night, as she reviewed her notes for tomorrow's cases, Judge Montgomery thought about the young security officer, Kevin, who had nodded to her that morning. She thought about Denise the clerk, who had tried to intervene at the checkpoint. She thought about all the people in the courthouse who had witnessed what happened. The confrontation with Officer Brennan hadn't just been about her. It had been about all of them, about who belonged in the halls of justice and who didn't, about whose authority was questioned and whose was automatically respected. Tomorrow would be another opportunity to address these questions, not through confrontation, but through education. Judge Montgomery closed her case files and went to bed, prepared to continue the conversation she had started today, a conversation about justice, about perception, and about the power of seeing beyond our assumptions to the humanity we all share. Morning arrived with a steady rain that drummed against the courthouse windows. Judge Montgomery arrived earlier than usual, determined to review every detail of the day's most important case before court began. As she passed through the staff entrance, she nodded to the security officer on duty. Not Officer Brennan, but the young black officer she'd noticed the day before. "Good morning, Your Honor," he said with a respectful nod. "Good morning," she replied, then paused. "Kevin, right?" His eyes widened slightly, surprised she knew his name. "Yes, ma'am." "Kevin Washington. Thank you for your professionalism, Officer Washington." She smiled and continued on her way, aware of his surprised but pleased expression as she walked past. In her chambers, Judge Montgomery spread out the files for the civil case of Taylor versus City Police Department. 16-year-old Andre Taylor had been playing basketball at a community center when Officer Paul Griffin responded to a call about suspicious activity. Body camera footage showed Andre being thrown to the ground and handcuffed, despite witnesses shouting that he was just a kid playing basketball. The teenager had suffered a dislocated shoulder and psychological trauma. His family was suing the department and the individual officer for excessive force. At 8:45, Teresa knocked on her door. "Your Honor, Officer Brennan is here." Judge Montgomery looked up, somewhat surprised. She hadn't been certain he would actually show up. "Send him in, please." Officer Brennan entered, looking slightly uncomfortable in the judicial chambers. "Good morning, Your Honor." "Good morning, Officer Brennan. Thank you for coming." She gestured to a chair. "Before we go to the courtroom, I wanted to give you some context about the case we're hearing today." She briefly explained the Taylor case, watching his expression carefully as she outlined the facts. "The question before the court isn't whether Officer Griffin followed department protocol. The department has already admitted he did not. The question is the amount of damages owed to the Taylor family, and whether the city is creating systemic change to prevent similar incidents." Officer Brennan nodded, his face thoughtful. "I understand." "I want to be clear," Judge Montgomery continued. "I'm not asking you to take sides or to comment on the case. I'm simply asking you to observe with an open mind." "Can you do that?" "Yes, Your Honor," he said, meeting her eyes directly. "I can." At precisely 9 a.m. they entered the courtroom from different doors, Judge Montgomery from her chambers, Officer Brennan through the public entrance. The courtroom was packed with journalists filling the back row. Civil cases like this one rarely drew media attention, but the racial elements and excessive force claims had made this a local headline. The Taylor family sat on one side of the courtroom, parents flanking their teenage son, whose arm was no longer in a sling, but who sat with the stiff posture of someone still in pain. On the other side sat the city's legal team and Officer Griffin, stone-faced in his dress uniform. "All rise," called the bailiff. "Court is now in session, the Honorable Judge Elaine Montgomery presiding." Judge Montgomery took her seat at the bench. "You may be seated. We're here today for case number 2025 CV 1845, Taylor versus City Police Department and Officer Paul Griffin. Are all parties present?" Both legal teams confirmed their presence and the proceedings began. The Taylor family's attorney presented their case first, showing the body camera footage that captured the incident. The video was difficult to watch. Andre, a lanky teenager in basketball shorts and a t-shirt, being thrown to the ground, his face pressed into the concrete as he cried out in pain and confusion. Judge Montgomery noticed Officer Brennan's posture stiffen as he watched the video. From the bench, she could see his eyes darting between the footage on the screen and the real teenager sitting in the courtroom. The city's attorney argued that while the officer's actions were regrettable, the damages sought were excessive. Officer Griffin has already been disciplined through administrative action. He's completed additional training and has expressed remorse for his mistake. Judge Montgomery turned to Officer Griffin. Is that correct, officer? Do you have remorse for what happened? Officer Griffin stood. Yes, Your Honor. I was responding to a call and made a split-second judgment based on the information I had. The call reported, and I quote, "Teenagers playing basketball too loudly," Judge Montgomery noted, looking at the report, "at a community recreation center. During operating hours," Officer Griffin shifted uncomfortably. "The caller mentioned possible drug activity, Your Honor. Yet no drugs were found, and according to witness statements, no one was doing anything remotely suspicious." Judge Montgomery's voice remained calm but firm. "When you arrived, what did you see that made you believe force was necessary?" Officer Griffin hesitated. "Looking back, I recognize I acted too quickly. The department has protocols for juvenile interactions that I failed to follow." From his seat, Andre Taylor watched the officer with an expression that mixed anger and fear. His mother kept a protective hand on his arm. After both sides had presented their cases, Judge Montgomery called a short recess. She returned to her chambers, unsurprised when Teresa informed her that Officer Brennan was asking to speak with her. "Send him in," she said. Officer Brennan entered, his face troubled. "Your Honor, I wanted to ask, that video, is that typical of what you see in these cases?" Judge Montgomery considered her answer carefully. "Unfortunately, it's not uncommon. What are your thoughts about what you saw?" He shook his head slowly. "That kid wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just playing basketball." He paused. If that had been a white kid at a suburban community center, he didn't finish the sentence. "He didn't need to. That's the reality many people face, Officer Brennan," she said quietly. "Different responses based solely on appearance. Like how I treated you yesterday," he acknowledged, the connection finally clear to him. She nodded. "On a much smaller scale, but yes, the pattern is the same." When court resumed, Judge Montgomery listened as both attorneys made their closing arguments. Then she addressed the courtroom. "I'll take this matter under advisement and issue my ruling tomorrow morning. Court is adjourned until 10 a.m. As people filed out, she noticed Officer Brennan lingering, watching as the Taylor family huddled with their attorney. Andre Taylor caught him looking and stiffened, clearly uncomfortable under the gaze of another officer. Officer Brennan quickly looked away. Later in her chambers, Judge Montgomery was drafting her ruling when another knock came at her door. Chief Rodriguez entered, followed by Officer Brennan. "Judge Montgomery," the chief began, "Officer Brennan has something he'd like to discuss with you." Officer Brennan stepped forward. "Your Honor, after what I've witnessed over the past 2 days, I've been doing a lot of thinking. I've asked Chief Rodriguez about the possibility of starting a program, a sort of exchange between courthouse security and the judges." Judge Montgomery raised her eyebrows, intrigued. "What kind of exchange?" "New security officers would spend time observing in different courtrooms, learning about the legal process from the inside. And perhaps judges could occasionally share insights with security staff about what they see in their courtrooms, patterns of justice and injustice that we should be aware of." Chief Rodriguez nodded. "Officer Brennan brought me this idea this afternoon. I think it has merit. It could help bridge the gap between different parts of our justice system." Judge Montgomery felt a spark of hope. "I agree," she said. "In fact, I'd be willing to help develop such a program." After they left, she returned to writing her ruling in the Taylor case, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Her encounter with Officer Brennan had started as an all-too-familiar experience of discrimination, but it was transforming into something unexpected, a potential catalyst for change. That evening, as she drove home, Judge Montgomery's phone rang. It was Richard Wilson, the courthouse administrator. "Elaine," he said when she answered, "I've been hearing about your impromptu educational program with Officer Brennan. Word spreading through the courthouse. Is that a problem?" she asked, suddenly concerned. "Quite the opposite," Richard replied. "The Chief Justice called me today. She wants to discuss implementing something similar throughout the courthouse system. Apparently, one of the reporters noticed Officer Brennan in your courtroom and asked questions. The story's gaining traction." Judge Montgomery hadn't considered the wider implications of her actions. She'd simply been trying to turn a negative experience into a teaching moment. "This could be the beginning of something important, Elaine," Richard continued. "Would you be willing to meet with the Chief Justice to discuss it?" Of course, she agreed, surprised but pleased. That night she told William about the developments. "It's strange," she said as they sat on their back porch, watching the rain that had continued all day. What began as just another discouraging incident might actually lead to meaningful change. William squeezed her hand. "That's because you didn't just react with anger, even though you had every right to. You saw an opportunity to educate." Judge Montgomery thought about Andre Taylor and his family, about Officer Griffin, about Officer Brennan. She thought about all the interconnected lives touched by the justice system for better or worse. "Tomorrow I'll issue my ruling in the Taylor case," she said. "I'm ordering significant damages but also requiring the police department to implement new training protocols." She looked at William. "And I'm going to recommend they consider a program like the one Officer Brennan suggested, creating opportunities for officers to see the human consequences of their actions in the courtroom." William nodded. "It won't fix everything." "No," she agreed. "But it's a start. Sometimes change happens in small moments, in individual hearts and minds." She thought of Officer Brennan's face as he'd watched the body camera footage, as he'd seen Andre Taylor sitting in the courtroom. She'd witnessed his perspective shifting in real time. "I've been a judge for 15 years, she said softly. "Sometimes I wonder if anything I do makes a difference in the larger patterns of injustice. But today I feel like maybe it does." The rain began to ease, and a patch of evening sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden light across their yard. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new cases, new opportunities to administer justice with wisdom and compassion. But tonight, Judge Elaine Montgomery allowed herself to feel something that had been too rare in her professional life: hope for genuine change. 6 months had passed since that rainy day when Judge Montgomery issued her ruling in the Taylor case. The courthouse looked the same from the outside. The same imposing columns, the same broad steps leading to the entrance, the same American flag fluttering in the breeze. But inside, subtle changes had taken root and begun to grow. Judge Montgomery parked in her usual spot and gathered her things. As she walked toward the staff entrance, she smiled at the memory of that confrontation with Officer Brennan. So much had changed since then. "Good morning, Judge Montgomery," called Officer Washington as she approached the security checkpoint. Behind him stood a young female officer she didn't recognize, watching closely as he demonstrated the security protocols. "Good morning, Officer Washington. Training a new colleague?" she asked. He nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. Officer Chen just started yesterday. She'll be joining your courtroom observation program next week." The young officer smiled nervously. "It's an honor to meet you, Judge Montgomery. I've heard so much about your program." "I look forward to having you," Judge Montgomery replied warmly. "Officer Washington will tell you it's not always exciting. Lots of procedural hearings and routine cases, but I think you'll find it enlightening." What had begun as an impromptu teaching moment with Officer Brennan had evolved into a formal program, now mandatory for all new security personnel at the courthouse. New officers spent their first month not just standing at checkpoints but sitting in courtrooms, observing the human consequences of the justice system in action. The program had been expanded to include ride-alongs for judges with police officers as well, giving them a chance to see the challenges faced by law enforcement firsthand. As Judge Montgomery made her way to her chambers, she greeted the courthouse staff by name. The atmosphere had changed subtly over the past 6 months. A greater sense of community, of shared purpose among the different roles that kept the justice system functioning. Teresa was waiting in the outer office with a cup of coffee and a stack of files. "Good morning, Your Honor. The quarterly report on the observation program is ready for your review before the committee meeting." "Thank you, Teresa. Any other updates this morning? Chief Justice Winters called to confirm you'll be speaking at next month's judicial conference about the program. And, Teresa smiled, Officer Brennan dropped by earlier. He left something for you. She handed Judge Montgomery a newspaper clipping. It was from that morning's paper, an article about the dramatic reduction in excessive force complaints against the city's police department over the past 6 months. The article credited several initiatives, including the Courthouse observation program that had now spread to 3 neighboring counties. Judge Montgomery smiled as she read it. Please tell Officer Brennan thank you when you see him. You can tell him yourself, Teresa replied. He's observing in Judge Rivera's courtroom today, but he mentioned he'd stop by during the lunch recess. In her office, Judge Montgomery reviewed the quarterly report. The statistics were encouraging. Improved relations between courthouse security and staff, positive feedback from officers who had completed the observation program, and anecdotal evidence of better interactions between police and the community. It wasn't a cure-all for the deep-rooted problems in the justice system, but it was a step in the right direction. Her morning court session was routine. Several plea agreements, a sentencing hearing, and a probation violation. Throughout the proceedings, she noticed Officer Chen sitting in the observer section, taking notes and watching intently. These observations had become so commonplace now that no one gave them a second thought. During the lunch recess, Officer Brennan knocked on her chamber door. He looked different than he had 6 months ago, more at ease in the courthouse environment, more confident in his role. Officer Brennan, please come in, Judge Montgomery said. I got your newspaper clipping. The program seems to be making an impact. It is, he agreed, taking a seat. But there's still a long way to go. That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about. Over the past months, their initial confrontation had evolved into a working relationship based on mutual respect. Officer Brennan had become one of the strongest advocates for the observation program, speaking candidly to new officers about his own experience of confronting and overcoming bias. I've been thinking about the next steps, he continued. The observation program is working well for new officers. But what about those who've been in the system for years? The ones most set in their ways? Judge Montgomery nodded thoughtfully. You're right. Changing ingrained attitudes is much harder than shaping new ones. I've been talking with some of the veteran officers, trying to get them to volunteer for the program. Some are receptive, but others, he shrugged. They see it as a waste of time. They think they already know everything they need to know about the courts. And about who belongs in them, Judge Montgomery added quietly. Exactly. Officer Brennan leaned forward. So I had an idea. What if we created a panel discussion? Bring together judges, officers, public defenders, prosecutors, and people who've been through the system as defendants. Let everyone hear different perspectives in a structured setting. Judge Montgomery considered the suggestion. It has merit. I'd be willing to help organize something like that. They spent the next half hour discussing logistics and potential participants. As Officer Brennan was leaving, he paused at the door. 6 months ago, if someone had told me I'd be working on diversity initiatives with the judge I disrespected at a security checkpoint, I would have thought they were crazy. Judge Montgomery smiled. Life takes unexpected turns sometimes. I wanted to thank you, he said seriously. You could have filed a complaint that day, had me disciplined or transferred. Instead, you took the time to educate me. It changed everything. Not just for me, but for a lot of other people too. After he left, Judge Montgomery thought about how much had changed and how much remained the same. That morning's newspaper had also carried a story about a black teenager arrested for looking suspicious while waiting for a bus. The work was far from over. Later that afternoon, she had a meeting with the Chief Justice and the courthouse administrator to discuss expanding the program statewide. The Chief Justice, an older white woman with 4 decades of legal experience, had become a strong supporter after seeing the program's early results. Judge Montgomery, she said as they reviewed the proposal, what you've created here has potential far beyond our courthouse. The governor's office has expressed interest in implementing similar programs throughout the state justice system. Judge Montgomery felt a surge of pride tempered with realistic expectations. It's just one small step, Your Honor. The issues we're addressing have deep roots. Indeed they do, the Chief Justice agreed. But meaningful change often starts with small steps. 6 months ago, we had a problem with how some officers treated people they deemed didn't belong in the courthouse. Now we have a solution that's changing attitudes and behaviors. That's significant. As the meeting concluded, Richard Wilson handed her an envelope. This came for you today. I think you'll want to read it. Back in her chambers, Judge Montgomery opened the envelope to find a handwritten letter from Andre Taylor, the teenager from the excessive force case. He wrote that he was now applying to college with plans to study criminal justice. His experience in her courtroom had shown him that change was possible within the system. He wanted to be part of that change. Judge Montgomery felt tears sting her eyes as she read his words. Seeing you on that bench, looking like me, treating everyone with respect and fairness, it made me believe that I could make a difference too. She carefully folded the letter and placed it in her desk drawer alongside other notes she had received. Over the years, small reminders of lives touched by her work. As she prepared to leave for the day, she passed the staff entrance where her confrontation with Officer Brennan had occurred 6 months earlier. Officer Chen was now at the checkpoint, carefully checking IDs while maintaining a respectful demeanor with everyone who passed through. Outside, the setting sun bathed the courthouse steps in golden light. Judge Montgomery paused for a moment, taking in the scene. People of all backgrounds moved up and down the steps. Attorneys with briefcases, families supporting loved ones, defendants nervously approaching their hearings, court staff heading home after a long day. A courthouse should be a place where justice was not just discussed but demonstrated, where everyone was treated with dignity regardless of their appearance or position. They weren't there yet, not fully, but they were taking steps in the right direction. As Judge Montgomery walked to her car, she reflected on how a single confrontation had sparked a movement for change. The racist harassment she'd experienced that morning had been painfully familiar, the kind of incident Black professionals faced regularly throughout their careers. But what had followed was something new, not just personal growth for Officer Brennan, but institutional change that touched countless lives. That was the power of turning pain into purpose, of responding to discrimination not just with righteous anger but with determined education. Small ripples could indeed become powerful waves. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to bridge divides and build understanding. The work would continue, step by step, day by day, person by person. And Judge Elaine Montgomery would be there, turning moments of conflict into catalysts for change, building a justice system that truly lived up to its name.